Sometimes grief drives us to the quietest corners of the world, where we hope the silence will somehow make sense of our loss. That's where 62-year-old Marla Kinsey found herself after her husband died alone in the Sawtooth Mountains, with nothing but her German shepherd, Boone, and memories that wouldn't let her rest. One morning by the river, she discovered strange eggs buried in the gravel. When she reached for them, Boone attacked with a fury she'd never seen, blocking her path like his life depended on it. Something ancient was stirring beneath that riverbed. What did her dog sense that she couldn't see? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood where it had always stood, tucked into a fold of the Sawtooth Mountains, like a secret kept by the pines. Marla's grandfather had built it in 1947 with timber he'd cut himself. And the place still carried that stubborn permanence of post-war construction, straight lines, honest joinery, nothing fancy, but everything solid. Gerald had loved that about it. He'd spent 40 summers here with her, studying the alpine meadows and cataloging every wildflower that pushed through the thin mountain soil dot. Now it was just Marla and Boone, and the silence that filled the spaces Gerald used to occupy. She woke before dawn most mornings, not from any particular discipline, but because sleep had become unreliable. The bed felt too large, and her mind had a habit of pulling her awake at odd hours with memories she wasn't ready to sort through. This morning was no different. The first gray light was just beginning to soften the darkness outside when she pushed back the quilts and set her feet on the cold floorboards. Boone lifted his head from his bed by the wood stove, thumping his tail twice in greeting. He was 7 years old, a solid German shepherd with the kind of steady temperament Gerald had always said was worth more than any amount of training. They'd gotten him as a pup the summer Gerald's diagnosis came back, though neither of them had said out loud that they were thinking about Marla being alone someday. She pulled on wool socks and the flannel robe that hung on the bedpost, then padded into the kitchen. The propane stove clicked and caught when she turned the burner, and she filled the kettle from the 5-gallon jug by the sink. Water was a twice-weekly chore, filling jugs at the spring a quarter mile up the slope, but she didn't mind it. The routine kept her moving, kept her from sitting too long with her thoughts. While the water heated, she opened the damper on the wood stove and added 2 splits of lodgepole pine to the coals. The fire caught quickly, and the stove began to tick as the metal expanded. Outside, the forest was still dark, but she could hear the river's constant voice through the trees. It ran about 200 yards west of the cabin, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above, and its sound had become the soundtrack to her solitude. Gerald's field journal sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it the night before. She touched the worn leather cover, but didn't open it. Not yet. Some mornings she could read his neat handwriting without her throat closing up, but some mornings she couldn't. This felt like one of the latter. The kettle whistled, and she made coffee in the French press Gerald had insisted on bringing up every summer. "Life's too short for bad coffee," he used to say, which had seemed funny until it wasn't. She poured a cup and stood by the window, watching the light grow. The cabin was small, one main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom barely big enough for the double bed and dresser, and an outhouse 30 feet from the back door. No electricity except what the small solar panel provided for the radio and a few LED lights. No phone service. The nearest neighbor was the Henderson place, 3 miles east, and the nearest town was Shalley, 47 miles down a logging road that turned to mud every spring. Gerald had called it freedom. His daughter called it foolishness, especially now that Marla insisted on staying through the seasons alone. "Mom, you're 62 years old," Jessie had said on the phone last month, her voice tight with worry. "What if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or—" "Then I'll deal with it," Marla had told her, more sharply than she'd intended. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Jess." The conversation had ended badly. the way most of their conversations ended these days. Jesse wanted her to come to Boise, to sell the cabin, to start some new chapter in a condo with other widows and a book club, and whatever else people did when they decided their living was done and all that remained was waiting. Marla wasn't ready for that. Maybe she never would be. She finished her coffee and dressed in Layer's thermal underwear, canvas pants, a cotton shirt and wool sweater, her old Carhartt jacket. April in the mountains meant cold mornings and warm afternoons, and she'd learned to dress for both. Boone watched her preparations with interest, recognizing the signs of a walk. "Come on, boy," she said, and he was on his feet instantly, tail wagging. They stepped out into the morning. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine resin and wet earth. The snow had mostly melted except in the deepest shadows, and the meadow around the cabin was starting to green up. In another month, it would be thick with lupine and Indian paintbrush, the colors so bright they almost hurt to look at. She followed the familiar path toward the river, Boone ranging ahead but never out of sight. This was their routine, a morning walk to check the area, gather any edible greens that were coming up, and simply move through the forest the way Gerald had taught her. He'd been a botanist by training and temperament, always stopping to examine some moss or lichen, always pulling out his hand lens to look closer at the world. She carried a canvas bag for foraging and wore the knife Gerald had given her on their 20th anniversary. It was a good knife, simple and sharp, and she'd used it for everything from cutting rope to cleaning trout. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and it fit her hand like it belonged there. The river came into view through the trees, its surface catching the early light. The sound of it grew louder as she approached, not the angry rush of spring runoff yet, but the steady, purposeful flow of snowmelt working its way down from the high country. She'd always loved this sound. Gerald used to joke that she was part salmon, the way she was drawn to moving water. Boone had stopped at the tree line, his posture alert. She caught up to him and scratched behind his ears. "What is it, boy?" "Deer?" But he wasn't looking into the forest. He was staring at the riverbank. His body tensed. She followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual at first, just a familiar tumble of river stones, the dark water, the scrub willow beginning to bud out along the far bank. Then her eye caught something that didn't fit, a shape in the gravel, maybe 20 feet upstream from where she stood. She moved closer. Boone pressed against her leg. Thought it was a nest of some kind, though not like any bird's nest she'd seen. The eggs, and they were definitely eggs, sat in a shallow depression in the stones, half buried in the coarse sand and gravel that the river had deposited during the high water. There were 6 of them, each about the size of a goose egg but with a strange mottled appearance. The shells were a pale gray with darker veining, almost like marble, and they had a faint sheen that caught the light oddly. Marla knelt beside them, her forester's curiosity overriding her caution. She'd seen plenty of nests in her years here. Ducks, geese, even once a trumpeter swan, but nothing like this. The eggs were too large for most waterfowl, and the coloring was all wrong. And why would anything nest this close to the waterline? In early spring, when floods were still common, she reached out to touch one, wanting to feel the texture of the shell, to understand what she was looking at. Boone lunged forward with a sound she'd never heard him make, a deep, guttural snarl that seemed to come from somewhere primal. He positioned himself between her and the nest, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. His eyes were fixed on the eggs with an intensity that bordered on fury. "Boone!" She pulled her hand back, startled. "What's gotten into you?" But he didn't relax. He stood his ground, every muscle rigid, and the growl continued low in his throat. She'd had him since he was 8 weeks old, had trained him, trusted him completely, and she'd never seen him act like this. Not with bears, not with mountain lions they'd glimpsed at a distance, not with anything. She stood slowly, backing away from the nest. Boone moved with her, never taking his eyes off the eggs. His behavior sent a cold thread of unease through her chest. Dogs knew things. They sensed things humans missed. Gerald had always said that Boone was smarter than half the people he'd met. And right now, every instinct in that dog was screaming danger. When they were a safe distance away, Boone finally relaxed slightly, though he kept glancing back toward the river. Marla's mind was racing. The eggs themselves were strange enough, but Boone's reaction troubled her more. She'd trust his judgment over her own curiosity any day. They returned to the cabin by a different route, Boone staying close to her side. The morning had taken on a different quality now, the familiar landscape feeling somehow less certain. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, though she couldn't have said what she was looking for. Back at the cabin, she made breakfast oatmeal with dried cranberries and a spoonful of honey from the jar she'd bought in Chalet last fall. She ate mechanically, her mind still on those eggs. After she'd washed her bowl and put it away, she finally opened Gerald's journal. His handwriting was precise, the letters small and carefully formed. She'd seen him write in this journal countless times, sitting at this same table or perched on a rock outcrop somewhere with his hand lens hanging around his neck. The entries were dated, organized by season and location, filled with botanical observations and sketches that showed his eye for detail. She paged through slowly, looking for anything that might relate to what she'd seen. Most entries were straightforward species, names, bloom times, soil conditions, notes about pollinators or symbiotic relationships. But as she moved into the entries from his final year, she began to notice a change in tone. The observations became more speculative, more concerned. One entry from September caught her attention, found unusual growth patterns in the riparian. Zone accelerated by at least 3 weeks compared to previous years. Some specimens showing characteristics inconsistent with known variations. Environmental factor? Worth monitoring. Another from October. Water flow has changed. Not just seasonal variation, something about the sound is different. Asked Marla if she noticed. She said no, but I can hear it. The river remembers things we've forgotten. That last line gave her pause. It didn't sound like Gerald's usual scientific notation. It sounded like something else entirely, something closer to poetry or prophecy. She kept reading, and the entries grew stranger. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Marla lay in the darkness, listening to the cabin settle and Boone's steady breathing from his bed across the room. Her mind kept circling back to the eggs, to Boone's reaction, to Gerald's increasingly odd journal entries from his final months. When she finally drifted off near midnight, her dreams were fragmented and uneasy images of the river rising, of something moving beneath the water's surface, of Gerald standing at the forest's edge trying to tell her something she couldn't quite hear. She woke at first light with a decision already made. She had to see the eggs again. Maybe in the clearer light of morning, they'd make more sense. Maybe she'd been tired yesterday, her imagination filling in strangeness where there was only the ordinary. Boone had probably just smelled a predator, nearby a fox or coyote that had been investigating the nest. There had to be a reasonable explanation. She dressed quickly and filled a thermos with coffee. Boone was less enthusiastic about the walk. This morning, staying close to her legs as they crossed the meadow. The sun was just cresting the peaks to the east, throwing long shadows through the pines. Everything looked crystalline and new, the way early mornings in the mountains always did. But Marla felt a tightness in her chest that wouldn't ease. When they reached the river, she saw immediately that something had changed. The nest had been disturbed. The eggs weren't arranged the way they'd been yesterday. They'd been moved, shifted, rearranged in the gravel. And one of them was cracked open, split cleanly in half. The shell fragments lay beside the depression, their interior surface catching the light with an iridescent shimmer that seemed almost to pulse. Marla's throat went dry. She scanned the area, looking for tracks, for any sign of what had been here. Boone had stopped 10 feet back, refusing to come closer, his ears flat against his skull. The tracks were there in the soft sand at the water's edge, but they weren't like anything she knew. Too large for a coyote, the wrong shape for a bear. The prints were deep, as if whatever made them had significant weight, and they showed what might have been claws or talons pressed into the mud. They led from the nest into the river and disappeared. She crouched down, studying the empty eggshell. Something had hatched from it, or something had eaten what was inside. The edges of the break were clean, almost surgically precise, and that iridescent inner coating seemed to shift colors as she tilted her head. Without thinking clearly, acting on instinct or perhaps simple denial, she picked up one of the fragments and slipped it into her jacket pocket. The moment her fingers closed around the shell, Boone barked sharply once, twice a warning. She turned to look at him, and his eyes were locked not on her but on the river. Following his gaze, she saw nothing but the water's surface, but she felt something, a pressure in the air, a heaviness that made her ears pop slightly. The sensation lasted only a moment, then passed, leaving her feeling unsteady. "Okay, boy," she said quietly. "Let's go." They returned to the cabin at a faster pace than she usually walked. Marla's mind was working hard to fit what she'd seen into some framework that made sense. Migration patterns, perhaps. Some species she wasn't familiar with. The mountains held plenty of mysteries, and she'd never claimed to know them all. But that feeling by the river stayed with her. That sense of being noticed. She spent the afternoon trying to focus on routine tasks, splitting kindling, organizing the pantry, making a list of supplies she'd need to bring up from town on her next trip. But she kept finding herself drawn to the shell fragment which she'd placed on the kitchen table. In the dimness of the cabin, it definitely glowed a faint greenish luminescence that seemed biological rather than chemical. As evening approached, she turned on the radio. The cabin's solar panel provided enough power for a few hours of use, and she usually listened to the weather report and news from the public radio station out of Salmon. Tonight, though, she wanted information. The weather report came first clear. Skies expected for the next few days, warming trend continuing. Then the local news segment. The announcer's voice was familiar, an older man who'd been doing this broadcast for as long as she could remember. U.S. Geological Survey reports a series of minor earthquakes in the central Idaho region over the past 2 weeks. The tremors, ranging from magnitude 2.1 to 3.4, have been centered in the Sawtooth Range. Seismologists say the activity is not unusual for the region and poses no immediate threat, but residents are encouraged to review earthquake preparedness procedures. Marla sat very still, listening. She hadn't felt any earthquakes, but she'd been distracted, grieving, not paying attention to much beyond her immediate needs. The earth had been moving beneath her feet, shifting, and she hadn't noticed. Gerald's Journal entry came back to her. When the earth shifts. She stood abruptly and went to the bedroom, pulling the journal from the nightstand. She flipped through the pages more carefully this time, looking for anything about earthquakes or geological events. Near the back, in one of his final entries, she found it. Thomas Red Hawk mentioned the old stories today when I saw him in town. He said the earth moving is a sign. Old things wake when the ground remembers, he told me. I asked him what that meant. He just looked at me with those sharp eyes of his and said, "Your grandfather knew to ask permission." Did you? I don't know what to make of it. We've been coming here for 40 years. Thomas Red Hawk. Marla knew the name a Shoshone elder who ran cultural programs at the tribal center in Shalley. Gerald had consulted with him occasionally about plant uses and traditional knowledge. She hadn't realized they'd talked about anything else. That night the sound started. Marla had grown accustomed to the forest night voices, the occasional owl, the rustle of wind through the pines, sometimes the yip of coyotes in the distance. But what she heard after midnight was different. It came from the direction of the river, a sound that was part vocalization and part something else, something she couldn't categorize. Not quite animal, not quite mechanical, but something that made her skin prickle. Boone was on his feet instantly, positioning himself at the door. His hackles were raised, and that low growl was back, the one that said everything in him recognized danger, even if he couldn't name it. The sound came again, closer this time. Marla reached for her rifle, a Remington 700 that had been her father's, and checked that it was loaded. The weight of it in her hands was reassuring, though some part of her questioned what exactly she thought she'd be shooting at. She moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, casting the clearing around the cabin in silver and shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then movement at the tree line caught her eye. Something was there, half hidden by the pines. It was large, she could tell that much, and it moved with a fluid grace that suggested power held in check. The shape was wrong for a bear, too vertical. Wrong for an elk or moose, the proportions unfamiliar. It paused at the edge of the clearing, and though she couldn't make out details in the darkness, she had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking directly at the cabin, directly at her. Her breath caught in her throat. Boone's growl intensified, and she put a hand on his head, as much to steady herself as to calm him. They stood there together in the darkness, watching the shape at the tree line, and it watched them back. The standoff lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt longer. Then the thing, whatever it was, turned and melted back into the forest with barely a sound. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable, and the next it was gone. Marla didn't move from the window for another hour. When she finally did, her legs were stiff and her hands were shaking. She set the rifle by the door, within easy reach, and sat at the table with her cold coffee and Gerald's journal. Not everything has a rational explanation, Gerald had told her once, years ago. They'd been sitting on the porch watching a meteor shower, and she'd been marveling at the physics of it rocks from space burning up an atmosphere, the speed and trajectories involved. He'd smiled at her need to explain everything and said, sometimes it's okay to just witness mystery without needing to solve it. She'd laughed at him then. Now she wished he were here to tell her what to do when mystery became threat. The shell fragment sat on the table, still glowing faintly. She picked it up, feeling its unnatural warmth against her palm. This was real. Whatever was happening wasn't in her imagination or in her grief-addled mind. Something had emerged from these eggs. Something was in the forest. And her dog, her steady and reliable Boone, was telling her in the only way he could that they were in danger. By the time dawn broke, she'd made another decision. She needed help, needed information, needed to talk to someone who might understand what Gerald had been trying to tell her in those final journal entries. The Henderson place was the closest. She'd check there first, see if they'd noticed anything unusual. And if they hadn't, or if they weren't home, she'd make the long drive to Shalley and find Thomas Redhawk. Because one thing was certain, she couldn't stay here in ignorance, waiting for whatever had hatched from those eggs to decide what came next. The walk to the Henderson place took her through terrain she knew well, a terrain she knew well, a Mayotte Dane trail that wound through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, crossing 2 seasonal creeks running high with snowmelt. Boone ranged ahead but kept looking back, his ears swiveling constantly, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. She'd brought the rifle, slinging it across her back. The weight of it was both comforting and ominous. The Henderson place sat in a natural clearing where Frank and Dolores, both in their 70s, spent their summers. They ran a few head of cattle, kept chickens, and mostly just enjoyed being away from town. Marla had shared coffee with them a handful of times over the years, the kind of neighborly relationship that exists between people who respect each other's solitude. As she approached through the trees, something felt wrong. The usual sounds were missing. No chickens clucking, no cattle lowing. The silence was complete, except for wind through the pines. She emerged into the clearing and stopped. The front door stood open, swinging slightly. The truck was gone. Boone moved forward cautiously, and she followed toward the house. "Hello?" she called out. "Frank? Dolores?" No answer. She climbed the porch steps, noting the door's hinges intact, not forced. Someone had left in a hurry. Through the doorway, she could see cabinet doors standing open in the kitchen. A coffee mug sat on the table, its contents dried to a brown ring. She stepped inside, rifle ready. The cabin felt abandoned in a way that went beyond mere absence. Bedroom undisturbed, except for the closet, where clothes had been grabbed in handfuls. Bathroom items scattered, as if someone had been packing quickly. In the kitchen, she found a note weighted down by a salt shaker. "Something's not right here. Cattle won't settle. Found 2 dead by the creek, not predator kill, something else. Radio says earthquakes, but it feels worse. Gone to Shally, maybe further. Don't know if we'll be back. Uffa." The date was 4 days ago. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Outside, the barn stood empty. Whatever had spooked the Hendersons had been enough to make them leave livestock behind. She found the 2 dead cattle near the creek. Boone refused to approach them, whining low. She moved closer despite her reluctance. The carcasses showed no obvious wounds, no signs of struggle. But the eyes were wrong, somehow sunken and dried in a way that didn't match the rest of the decay. And beneath the expected reek was a smell she couldn't identify, something chemical and strange. She backed away slowly. Whatever had killed these animals wasn't a normal predator. The Hendersons had been smart enough to recognize that and leave. Back at her cabin, she went straight to Gerald's research materials. He'd kept boxes of papers, photocopies, maps, notes from conversations with locals and tribal members. She searched with purpose now, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. Near the bottom of the second box, she found a folded map, old and yellowed, with careful annotations in ink that wasn't Gerald's handwriting. She spread it on the table. "What's due to you?" It was a topographical map of the Sawtooth Range, but overlaid with additional markings. Symbols she didn't recognize marked various locations. Lines connected some symbols and patterns that might have been boundaries. And there, near her own location, was a symbol that looked like a spiral within a circle. Next to it, in faded ink, Keeper's Crossing Place of Appeasement. Her cabin sat almost directly on the spiral symbol. Other locations were marked similarly: Threshold Spring, Guardian's Watch, Blood Meadow. The entire range was covered with these notations, as if the land had been divided into territories that had nothing to do with property lines. A smaller paper was folded inside. She opened it carefully. It was a photocopy of handwritten notes dated 5 years earlier. Conversation with Thomas Redhawk. August 2019. Thomas emphasized that certain locations were not meant for permanent settlement. The old boundaries were there for a reason, he said. Not to keep people out, but to keep other things in. When I asked what things, he told me about the Guardians, beings that sleep beneath the mountains and wake when the earth shifts or when boundaries are crossed without respect. I asked if he believed these stories, literally. He laughed and said, "Your grandfather understood that. He asked permission before he built." Did you? I didn't know how to answer. We've been coming here for 40 years without incident. But now I'm wondering what constitutes permission. The handwriting was Gerald's, shakier than usual. Written near the end, when his hands weren't steady. She read it 3 times, each pass making her chest tighter. Your grandfather understood. Her grandfather, who'd built this cabin in 1947, who'd chosen this specific location for reasons he'd never fully explained. She'd thought it was just woodcraft, accumulated wisdom. Now she wondered if it had been something more. She thought about the shell fragment, still on the table. She'd taken it without thinking, without any sense that protocols might be required. The realization made her feel foolish and exposed. Thomas Redhawk. Gerald had trusted him, sought his counsel. If anyone could help, it would be him. But leaving the cabin unprotected felt wrong. She'd seen the thing at the tree line. If it came back while she was gone, what would it do? She decided on the radio, the solar-powered one that could transmit. She'd contact the ranger station in Shalley, leave a message for Thomas. She powered it on and adjusted to the ranger station's frequency. Shalley Ranger Station. This is Marla Kinsey at the old Kinsey cabin. Do you copy? Over. Static. She tried again. On the third attempt. Copy, Marla. This is Ranger Webb. Everything okay? Over. I need to get a message to Thomas Redhawk at the tribal center. It's important. Over. A pause. Copy that. What's this regarding? Over. How did you explain over a radio that something ancient had woken in the mountains? That your husband's research had stumbled onto knowledge never meant to be written down? Tell him it's about the old stories. The Guardians. Tell him Gerald Kinsey's wife needs to speak with him about what's waking up. He'll understand. Over. Copy that, Marla. I'll pass it along. Over and out. She powered down and sat in the quiet cabin. All she could do now was wait and watch and try to understand what Gerald had been trying to tell her. Night would come again, and with it, another visit from whatever was circling her home. The response came sooner than expected. 2 days after her radio call, Ranger Webb contacted her to say Thomas Redhawk would drive up the following morning. He'd asked Webb to relay that he'd been waiting for this call. That night passed without incident, though she slept poorly. When dawn broke, she gave up on rest and made coffee, watching the logging road for Thomas's arrival. He came in an old Chevy pickup, navigating the ruts with practiced ease. Marla watched him park and step out, a man in his mid-70s, lean and weathered, moving with careful economy. His long gray hair was pulled back in a braid. She met him on the porch. Mr. Redhawk, thank you for coming. Thomas is fine, he said. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing as they swept across her face. The cabin, the forest. I didn't come just for you. I came because something's wrong in these mountains. Your husband knew it. Question is, do you? I don't know what I know anymore, she admitted. Come inside. This conversation needs to happen properly. They sat at her table. She poured coffee while Boone investigated Thomas cautiously. Tell me everything, he said. Start with the eggs. She did. The discovery by the river, Boone's reaction, the cracked egg, strange tracks. She showed him the glowing shell fragment, told him about the Hendersons fleeing, the dead cattle, the thing at her tree line. She showed him Gerald's journal and the annotated map. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat quietly, turning his coffee cup. Finally, your husband came to see me about 5 months before he died. He was already sick, but his mind was clear, and he was worried. He'd been documenting changes in plant life, animal behavior. He wanted to know if the old stories mentioned anything like that. He sipped his coffee. I told him what I'll tell you. The Guardians are real. Not metaphors, real. Physical. Ancient. They sleep most of the time, waking only when the earth shifts or their territories are disturbed. Her throat tightened. And you believe this? Literally? Truth exists whether we accept it or not. My grandfather saw one during the earthquake of 1944. He was 14. Camping near Redfish Lake, something came up from the deep water, wrong proportions, moving between forms, eyes that reflected light in ways animal eyes don't. Thomas leaned forward. Your cabin sits on a threshold, a boundary between where guardians sleep and where we live. Your grandfather knew that. He came to my grandfather before he built, asked permission. My grandfather performed a ceremony and told him the rules. Respect the land. Take only what you need. "Never disturb the river gravel where the guardians leave their signs." The words hit hard. The eggs had been in the river gravel. She'd reached for them, taken the fragment. I didn't know. Gerald didn't either, not until near the end. Knowledge gets lost. By the time he started asking questions, the earthquakes had already started. The eggs were already laid. He pulled out a small object wrapped in red cloth, revealing a copper disc inscribed with symbols. "This is a protection charm. The guardians recognize these marks. They show respect, that you understand there are rules." She took it carefully. "What do I do?" "Return what you took." The shell fragment goes back with an offering: tobacco, cornmeal, something from yourself. Hair or blood, though hair is sufficient. Speak the words I'll teach you, asking forgiveness and pledging respect. Then wait to see if the guardian accepts. And if it doesn't, his expression was grave. Then you leave, immediately. Take your dog and go. They spent the morning in preparation. He taught her words, Shoshone mixed with something older. He showed her how to bundle the offering, explained she should go at dawn, alone. The dog should stay, Thomas said. The guardian knows him as a protector. You need to approach as a supplicant. Before leaving, Thomas walked the perimeter, pausing at points to examine the ground. At the eastern corner, he stopped, troubled. It's been here recently. Last night, maybe. It's deciding about you, whether you belong, whether you're a threat. Your husband's blood connection kept you safe for 40 years. But he's gone now, and you're unknown. The offering is your chance to introduce yourself properly. He faced her. Be honest when you speak to it. Guardians sense deception. Tell the truth that you didn't know, that you want to honor the covenant now. And Marla, don't be afraid. Fear they understand. Dishonesty they can't abide. After Thomas left, she sat on the porch with Boone, watching afternoon light change the forest's color. She held the copper charm and shell fragment, feeling the weight of what she'd been asked to do. Tomorrow at dawn, she would find out if she was worthy. She barely slept that night. Every sound pulled her attention: wind through pines, an owl calling, Boone's restless movements. She rehearsed the words Thomas had taught her, worried about mispronouncing something crucial. Around 3, she gave up on sleep. She dressed by lamplight, her oldest jeans, Gerald's canvas jacket that still carried his scent. She wanted to wear something connecting her to this place, to the 40 years spent here, to the man whose blood had apparently kept her safe. The offering bundle sat on the table where she'd assembled it following Thomas's instructions. Red cloth. Inside, tobacco, cornmeal, dried sage, and her hair. Thick braid she'd cut from her neck. Cutting it had felt significant, like severing part of her identity to offer up something irreplaceable. She made coffee but couldn't drink it. Her stomach was too tight. Boone sensed her anxiety and stayed close. She crouched and wrapped her arms around him. You have to stay here, boy. I know you want to protect me, but I have to do this alone. Thomas said so. Boone whined softly. She held him another moment, then gathered the bundle and shell fragment. The copper charm hung around her neck, resting against her sternum where she could feel its weight. Dawn was 30 minutes away when she stepped onto the porch. The forest was suspended in pre-light stillness. She secured Boone inside, ignoring his barks. It tore at her to leave him, but she had to approach alone, vulnerable and honest. The walk to the river felt both too short and endless. Her feet knew the path. Overhead, the sky paled at the eastern edge. She reached the river just as light filtered through trees. The water's voice seemed quieter, subdued, waiting. The nest lay ahead. She approached slowly, watching her steps. Thomas had said everything mattered: her intention, her respect, how she moved through space. The 5 remaining eggs sat undisturbed. Following instructions, she placed 7 smooth stones in a circle around the nest, collected from the river, spring, meadow, forest floor. As she positioned each stone, she spoke the words Thomas taught her, introducing herself and acknowledging her ignorance. The words felt strange, consonants harsh, vowels shaped differently than English. But she spoke them clearly, putting intention behind each syllable. When the circle was complete, she placed the shell fragment at its center, then the offering bundle. Finally, she knelt in the gravel and spoke the longer prayer Thomas had made her memorize. She asked forgiveness. She acknowledged Gerald's connection through his grandmother's blood, admitted her ignorance. She spoke of 40 years here, her love for these mountains, her desire to honor what had been here long before. She offered her hair, her respect, her commitment to learning. The words came haltingly, then with confidence. She found herself speaking with her whole body posture, breathing, hands held open in supplication. When she finished, silence settled. She remained kneeling, waiting. The air thickened, pressure against her skin, in her ears. The river's surface began to ripple against the current. Then it emerged. Not from the forest, but from the water itself. The surface broke upstream, and something rose slowly, deliberately. Massive, easily the size of a grizzly, but shaped wrong. The form seemed to shift, never settling. Scales that became fur, that became something else. Limbs that were sometimes 4, sometimes more. But the eyes large and luminous, reflecting dawn with an internal glow. They fixed on her with intelligence that made her breath catch. This was a being, ancient and aware, looking at her with recognition and judgment. She held still, though instinct screamed to run. The guardian moved closer, water streaming from its body. It approached the stone circle, lowered its head to the offerings. She watched it investigate the tobacco, cornmeal, sage. When it reached her hair, it paused. Then, with surprising gentleness, it took the braid, lifting it to examine. The guardian's attention shifted to her. It moved forward until it stood directly before her, close enough she could feel heat from its body, smell its scent, ancient stone and deep water, and something beyond naming. It lowered its head until those eyes were level with hers, perhaps 3 feet away. This was the moment, the decision point where it would accept or reject her. She met its gaze and spoke in English, because truth needed words she fully understood. I didn't know. Gerald protected me, and I never knew how. I was ignorant, and I'm sorry. If you let me stay, I'll honor what's owed. I'll learn the proper ways. I'll tend this boundary like I should have been doing all along. The guardian watched her, measured her. She could feel its intelligence, assessing not just words, but intention, honesty, perhaps even memories and the content of her heart. The moment stretched. Her knees ached from kneeling on stones. Her muscles trembled. But she didn't move, didn't look away, didn't break the connection. The guardian made a sound, not quite vocalization, not quite something else. It resonated in her chest cavity, in her bones, a frequency that bypassed her ears entirely and registered somewhere deeper. She didn't understand it as language exactly, but she felt its meaning the way you might feel a shift in barometric, pressure before a storm, assessment, consideration, not hostility, but not acceptance either. Something in between. It circled her slowly, never taking those luminous eyes off her face. She remained kneeling, fighting the urge to track its movement, to protect her back. Vulnerability was the point, Thomas had said, showing that she trusted the guardian's judgment, that she wasn't trying to defend herself or maintain control. The circling stopped. The guardian returned to face her directly, and this time it lowered its head even further, close enough that she could see the impossible complexity of its form, the way scales overlapped with something that wasn't quite fur, the way its body seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. It exhaled, and she felt the breath against her face, warm and carrying that scent of deep places, of time and stone and things that had never seen sunlight. Then it did something she hadn't expected. It touched her, not with aggression, but with what seemed like curiosity. Something that might have been a paw or might have been something else entirely pressed lightly against her chest, directly over the copper charm. She felt the pressure, the weight, the undeniable physical reality of this being. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held still. The touch lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the guardian withdrew, stepping back. It turned toward the nest, toward her offerings, and with deliberate care, it took the bundle of tobacco in its jaws. She watched as it carried the bundle to the water's edge and placed it carefully where the current would take it downstream. An acceptance, she realized, a ritual completion. When it turned back to her, something had changed in its posture. The assessment was complete. The decision had been made. It spoke again, that same resonance in her bones. But this time, she understood. Not words, exactly, but concepts that formed in her mind with perfect clarity. Keeper. Tend. Remember. Then it walked past her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched it, and moved toward the forest. She watched it go, watched the way it seemed to blur at the edges, to become less solid as it moved away from the water. By the time it reached the tree line, it was more suggestion than substance. Then it was gone entirely, melted back into whatever deep place it called home. Marla remained kneeling for a long time after, her body shaking with released tension and something that might have been awe or might have been terror or might have been both. The sun had fully risen now, morning light turning the river gold. The eggs in the nest remained patient and strange. Her offerings lay where she'd placed them. Minus the tobacco the guardian had taken, she gathered the 7 stones, intending to keep them as Thomas had suggested, as a reminder of this moment, of the covenant she'd just entered. Her legs were stiff from kneeling, and she had to brace herself against a boulder to stand. Every part of her felt wrung out, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The walk back to the cabin was different than any walk she'd taken before. The forest felt changed, or perhaps she was the one who had changed. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to, the way certain trees grew in patterns, the places where the undergrowth was thicker or thinner, subtle markers in the landscape that might have been natural or might have been something else. The land was speaking, had always been speaking, and she was only now learning to hear it. Boone met her at the door, frantic with relief. He jumped and whined and circled her legs, checking her over for injuries, making sure she was whole and safe. She knelt and let him lick her face, holding him close, drawing comfort from his solid, uncomplicated love. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "We're okay. We can stay." Inside, she made the coffee she hadn't been able to drink earlier and sat at the table with Gerald's journal. She needed to document this, not just for herself, but for whoever might come after. The knowledge couldn't be lost again. That was part of being a keeper, she understood now. Maintaining not just the physical boundary, but the memory, the understanding, the respect. She wrote for hours, filling page after page with everything that had happened. The discovery of the eggs, Boone's warning, the Hendersons' flight, Thomas's visit, the ritual at the river, the guardian's appearance, and its final message. She wrote about Gerald's hidden heritage, about her grandfather's forgotten wisdom, about the way knowledge slips away across generations when we're not careful to preserve it. When she finally set down her pen, the sun was past its apex. Her hand ached from writing, but she felt clearer than she had in months. Since Gerald's death, she'd been drifting, going through motions without purpose. Now she had purpose again, not just surviving, but serving. Being a keeper meant responsibility, meant attention, meant being part of something larger than her own grief. She tried the radio that evening, hoping to reach Thomas and tell him what had happened. But the atmospheric conditions were wrong, and all she got was static. She'd have to wait for the next scheduled check-in, or make the drive to town herself. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. She still maintained her usual routines, fetching water, tending the garden plot she'd started, splitting wood for the stove. But now she added new tasks, informed by what Thomas had taught her and by what she was learning from careful observation. She walked the boundary each morning, not with Boone's protective urgency, but with attention and respect. She learned to read the signs places where the guardian had passed, marks in the earth or on trees that indicated its territory and its movements. She began to understand the pattern of the land, the way water flowed and where certain plants grew and how the wildlife moved through the forest. She found Gerald's field notebook a separate journal from the one he'd kept for personal observations and discovered that he'd been documenting these same things in his final months, though without the context to understand what he was seeing. He'd noted unusual plant growth in specific areas, animals avoiding certain paths, changes in the river's flow that didn't match weather patterns. He'd been seeing the evidence of the guardian's presence without knowing what he was looking at. One afternoon, while reviewing his botanical sketches, she found something that made her stop. Pressed between the pages was a flower she didn't recognize, delicate petals that seemed to shimmer even in their dried state, colors that shouldn't exist together. A note in Gerald's handwriting beside it read, "Found near the nest site, species unknown." Similar to a quietest, but with additional structures. Possibly mutation? Or something older. She held the pressed flower carefully, understanding now what Gerald had been too sick or too close to death to fully process. This wasn't a mutation. It was something that grew in the guardian's presence, something that existed at the boundary between the ordinary world and the deep places. She'd seen similar flowers during her morning walk, small populations growing in specific locations, always near water, always in places where she could feel that subtle pressure in the air. That indicated the guardian's territory. She began her own collection, documenting these boundary plants with careful notes about location and growing conditions. It was work Gerald would have understood, would have valued. A way of continuing what he'd started, but with the fuller knowledge he'd been reaching for. 2 weeks after the ritual at the river, she was working in the garden when Boone alerted. Not the aggressive warning he'd given at the eggs, but a different stance, attentive, interested, not threatened. She looked up to see a figure emerging from the tree line. Thomas Redhawk walked toward the cabin, moving with his usual economy of motion. She met him at the edge of the garden, wiping dirt from her hands. "You're still here," he said, and she heard the approval in his voice. "That's good. I wasn't sure which way it would go." "It accepted me," she told him. "Or at least, it decided I could stay. It told me." She paused, trying to find words for something that hadn't been conveyed in language. "It told me to tend, to keep, to remember." Thomas nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "The guardian chose you as keeper. That's rare. Usually the role passes through family lines, but Gerald's death broke that continuity. The guardian could have driven you out and waited for the next generation, but it saw something in you worth keeping." They sat on the porch, and she told him everything about the ritual and the guardian's response. He listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, nodding at certain details. "You'll need to learn more," he said finally. "The words I taught you are just the beginning. There are protocols for different situations, different seasons. Ways to read the land, to understand what the guardian needs, to maintain the balance. I can teach you some of it, but the rest you'll learn by paying attention. The land will teach you if you're willing to listen." "I'm willing," she said. "Whatever it takes." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Good, because this isn't just about you anymore. The guardians are waking across the range. The earthquakes are continuing. Other boundaries will need tending. Other keepers will need to be found or taught. You're part of a network now, whether you knew it existed or not." The thought was simultaneously daunting and comforting. She wasn't alone in this. There were others scattered across these mountains, doing the same work, holding the same knowledge. It made the task feel less impossible. Before Thomas left, he walked with her to the river. The eggs were still there, undisturbed. "They'll hatch in their own time," he said. "When they do, don't interfere. The young ones need to find their way to deep water on their own. Your job is just to make sure nothing else interferes with them. No humans, no heavy machinery, no one who doesn't understand what they're looking at." "Will they be like the Guardian?" she asked. "Dangerous?" "They'll be young," Thomas said. "Still forming, still learning what they are. Dangerous in the way anything powerful and unknowing is dangerous. But if they're left alone, they'll slip into the deep places and sleep for generations before they wake again. That's the cycle. That's how it's supposed to work." After he left, Marla stood by the river for a long time, watching the water flow and the eggs rest in their gravel nest. She thought about cycles and generations, about knowledge passed down and lost and rediscovered. She thought about Gerald and what he would make of all this, whether he'd be proud of her or worried for her or both. The sun was setting when she finally turned to walk back to the cabin. As she did, she caught movement at the edge of her vision, something large and fluid moving through the trees on the far bank. The Guardian, watching, making sure she understood her role, making sure she was taking it seriously. She stopped and spoke aloud, her voice carrying across the water. "I'm here. I'm learning. I'll do right by this place." The movement stilled, then faded. But she felt acknowledged, seen, accepted into something ancient and ongoing, something that would outlast her lifetime and her children's lifetimes and generations. Beyond counting dots, she was a keeper now. And for the first time since Gerald's death, she felt like she belonged to something larger than her grief. 3 weeks passed in the new rhythm of her keeper's life. Marla woke each morning before dawn, walked the boundary with increasing confidence, learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the Guardian's movements and the health of the threshold. The eggs by the river remained untouched, patient in their waiting. She checked them daily, noted small changes, a slight warming of the shells, occasional movement within, the sense that something was developing in its own time. She'd started keeping 2 journals now. One was a continuation of Gerald's scientific observations, plant species, animal behavior, weather patterns, all the practical data that helped her understand the ecosystem she was protecting. The other was more personal, a record of her experiences as keeper, the things Thomas taught her, the moments when she felt the Guardian's presence, even when she couldn't see it. It was while organizing Gerald's personal effects, a task she'd been avoiding since his death, that she found what changed everything. She'd been going through the old wooden trunk he kept at the foot of their bed, the one he brought from his childhood home when they'd first married. She knew what was in it, generally family photos, a few mementos from his early research trips, documents related to the cabin's ownership. She'd never had reason to examine it closely, but now, as keeper, she wanted to understand everything about this place and Gerald's connection to it. She needed to piece together the full history, to see what he'd known or suspected, to find any clues he might have left about how to do this work properly. The photos came out. First black and white images of people she'd never met. Gerald's parents, stiff and formal in their wedding portrait. His mother as a young woman, standing beside a horse. His father in military uniform. She set these aside carefully, making a mental note to send copies to Jessie, who'd asked about family history more than once. Beneath the photos were documents. The cabin's deed, showing the transfer from her grandfather to her father, then to her when her parents had died. Gerald's birth certificate, which she'd seen before. Marriage license. Discharge papers from his brief army service in the early 70s. Men, at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. More documents she'd never seen. The first was another birth certificate, Gerald's grandmother's. She unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle at the creases. And there it was, the information that recontextualized everything. Mother's name, Morning Crow. Father's name, William Treadwell. Tribal enrollment number listed for the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down the birth certificate and picked up the next document, a letter. Handwritten on lined paper, dated 1953. The handwriting was feminine. Careful, the ink faded but still legible. Dear William, I'm writing because you should know what your father never told you properly. The land you're building on isn't just land. My people, your people too. Though you were raised away from that, we know it as a threshold place. A boundary. Your father came to my father before he built the cabin. He asked permission, performed the ceremonies, made the offerings. He understood what it meant to live in that place. The guardians accepted him because he showed respect. You were just a boy when we lost touch, but you need to understand this. That land comes with responsibility. It's not just property to be passed down. It's a trust, a covenant. The guardians sleep deep, but they wake. They always wake. And when they do, there needs to be someone who knows how to tend the boundary properly. Your father knew this. I taught him what I could before he moved away and stopped answering my letters. I'd hoped to teach you too, but your father wanted you raised white without the confusion of two worlds. I respected that choice, even though I thought it was wrong. But now he's gone, and you have a son of your own, and I worry the knowledge is being lost. If you ever decide to return to that place, to truly live there and not just visit summers, you need to come see me first. I'll teach you what your father forgot to pass down. It's in your blood, William. The guardians will recognize that, but blood alone isn't enough. You need knowledge. You need respect. You need to understand what you're part of. The land remembers. Even when we forget. Your grandmother, Morning Crow Marla, read the letter 3 times, each pass making her understanding shift and deepen. Gerald's grandmother, Shoshone. The knowledge had been there, 1 generation back, but it hadn't been passed down. Gerald's father had made a choice to raise his son without that cultural connection, to present him as simply white American, to avoid the complications of mixed heritage in a time when such complications could close doors and limit opportunities, and Gerald had never known. Or, if he'd known about his grandmother's heritage in an abstract way, he'd never understood its significance, never connected it to the land or the cabin or the responsibility that came with that blood connection. She found more letters in the trunk, a whole correspondence between Morning Crow and her son, William, spanning from the 1950s into the early 1970s. The letters from Morning Crow were patient but increasingly urgent, asking William to bring his family to meet her, to let her teach young Gerald the old ways, to understand what it meant to be part of the land in that specific place. William's responses, carbon copies he'd kept, were polite but evasive. He'd visit sometime. Things were busy. Gerald was focused on his studies. Maybe next year. The letters from Morning Crow stopped in 1974. Marla found the obituary. Tucked into the last letter, Morning Crow had died at 78. And her son William had apparently chosen not to maintain the connection she'd been trying to preserve. The knowledge had been right there. 1 conversation away. 1 visit that never happened. And because of that choice or that avoidance, Gerald had lived his entire life walking on land that recognized his blood but didn't fully accept him because he'd never properly introduced himself. He'd been protected by ancestry alone, a thin shield that had held for 40 years but was never quite complete. She thought about his final year, his increasing worry, his conversations with Thomas Redhawk. He'd been trying to reconstruct what his grandmother had wanted to teach him. He'd been figuring it out too late when illness was already claiming him. When his time was running short, Marla sat on the floor surrounded by letters and photos and documents, feeling the weight of generational loss. Morning Crow had known. Her grandfather had known, in his way. But the chain had broken, and now here she was, 2 generations later, scrambling to relearn what should have been passed down intact. But there was something else in the realization, something empowering. Gerald's blood was part of this land, which meant their life together here. Their 40 years of marriage and research and simple existence hadn't been an intrusion. It had been a return, however incomplete. A reclaiming, however unconscious. And it meant that when the guardian had accepted her, it wasn't just accepting a stranger who'd married into proximity. It was accepting someone who'd been part of this place through marriage and love and shared life. Someone who'd earned belonging through time, even without blood. She gathered the documents carefully and brought them to the kitchen table. She needed to record this to make sure the knowledge didn't slip away again. She wrote out Morning Crow's full story as best she could piece it together from the letters. She documented the broken chain of teaching, the cultural disconnection, the way critical knowledge had been lost in the space of a single generation's choices. Then she did something that felt both necessary and somewhat ceremonial. She took one of the letters, not the first one, which was too precious, the one from the middle of the correspondence, and she brought it to the river. The eggs were still there, closer to hatching now. She could see the shells beginning to crack in fine lines. Preparation for emergence. She knelt by the nest and spoke. Not in the Shoshone words Thomas had taught her, but in plain English, talking to the guardian as she would talk to Gerald or to any other person who needed to understand something important. I found letters from Gerald's grandmother. Her name was Morning Crow, and she tried to teach her son what he needed to know about this place. But he didn't want to learn. He wanted to be just American, just white, and he raised Gerald the same way. The knowledge got lost. Not forgotten by the guardians, I know, but forgotten by the people who should have remembered. She placed the letter beside the nest, weighted down with stones so the wind wouldn't take it. Gerald was trying to figure it out at the end. He went to Thomas. He wrote down everything he could learn. He cared about this place, really cared, even if he didn't understand it properly. And I care too. I'm learning. Thomas is teaching me. But I wanted you to know, I wanted to acknowledge that this happened. That knowledge was lost, and people suffered for it. The Hendersons fled. Animals died. Gerald died without fully understanding his own heritage. She paused, feeling the weight of what she was saying. I can't fix the past, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm writing everything down. I'm learning properly, and I swear to you, to the land, to Gerald's memory, I won't let the chain break again. The air shifted. Not dramatically, but she felt it, that sense of presence, of being heard. The guardian was listening. Maybe approving, maybe just acknowledging. But listening. She stood and returned to the cabin, leaving the letter by the nest. It would dissolve in rain or wash away in high water, but that was fine. The gesture mattered more than the physical object. The acknowledgement mattered. Back inside. She made coffee and sat with Gerald's photograph, a candid shot from 20 years ago. Him laughing at something she'd said, his eyes bright and alive. You tried, she told him softly. At the end, when you finally understood, you tried to learn it all. I wish you'd have more time. I wish your father had made different choices. I wish Morning Crow had been able to teach you herself. She touched the photo gently. But I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to be the keeper you were becoming. And maybe, somehow, that makes the loss worthwhile. Maybe that's how these things are supposed to work. Each generation doing the best they can with what they were given. Trying to repair what was broken before. The sun was setting, throwing golden light through the cabin windows. Boone dozed by the stove. The forest outside was settling into evening stillness, and Marla sat with the weight of revelation, with the understanding that changed everything while changing nothing. She was still keeper. She still had work to do. But now she knew the full story, the blood connection that ran through Gerald to this land, the lost knowledge, The broken teaching, the weight of choices made by people long dead that still echoed in the present. And she knew that what she was doing mattered not just for herself, or even just for this one threshold, but for the continuation of something older and more important than any individual life. She was part of a chain that stretched back generations and would extend forward into futures she wouldn't live to see. The work was the same, but the meaning had deepened, and that made all the difference. The eggs began hatching on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Marla's discovery of Morning Crow's letters. She'd been walking the boundary as usual, Boone ranging ahead, when she noticed the change in the air, that particular pressure that signaled the Guardian's proximity. She altered course immediately, heading for the river, knowing somehow that this was the moment. The first egg had split cleanly down the middle, and something was emerging. Not a bird, not a reptile, but something that shared characteristics of both and neither. The hatchling was small, perhaps the size of a rabbit, with luminescent skin that seemed to shift between scales and something softer. Its eyes, when it opened them, had that same internal glow as the Guardian's, though dimmer, younger. Marla stayed back, remembering Thomas's instructions. Don't interfere. Let them find their own way. She watched as the first hatchling oriented itself, seeming to test the air, then made its way unsteadily toward the water. It slipped beneath the surface without hesitation, and she saw it swimming downstream, surprisingly graceful in the water despite its awkward movement on land. Over the next few hours, the other eggs hatched in sequence. Each hatchling followed the same pattern: emerge, orient, move to water, disappear into the current heading downstream toward deeper, older places where they would grow and sleep and eventually become something like their parent. She witnessed the entire process, documenting it carefully in her mind since she'd left her journal at the cabin in her haste to reach the river. When the last hatchling had gone, she approached the nest site. The shells remained, those strange mottled fragments that had started everything. She gathered them carefully, planning to keep them as Thomas had suggested, physical reminders of what she'd witnessed, what she'd been part of. As she collected the last fragment, she felt the Guardian's presence behind her. She turned slowly. It stood at the tree line, watching. In daylight, she could see it more clearly than she had during the ritual, the impossible fluidity of its form, the way it seemed to exist slightly out of phase with ordinary reality. But there was no threat in its posture now, only observation, perhaps even something like approval. "They're beautiful," she said aloud, not knowing if it would understand her words, but trusting it would understand the sentiment. "Thank you for letting me witness that." The Guardian inclined its head slightly, a gesture that felt more human than animal, then turned and melted back into the forest. She understood the message. This part was complete. The eggs had hatched, the young had gone to their deep places. The cycle had continued as it was meant to. Her role now was to maintain the boundary, to ensure the threshold remained undisturbed, to be present and attentive as the Guardian went back to its own sleeping and waking rhythms. But even as she understood this, even as she felt the rightness of the moment's completion, she knew something else was coming. The Guardian's waking had been triggered by more than just her transgression with the eggs. The earthquakes were continuing. Thomas had mentioned other boundaries, other awakenings. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. She returned to the cabin with the eggshell fragments and immediately tried the radio. The afternoon check-in window was still 2 hours away, but she needed to contact Thomas, to tell him what had happened, to get guidance on what came next. The radio crackled with static and distance, but she finally raised the Shally Ranger station. Ranger Webb sounded harried when he responded. "Marla, glad you called in. Been trying to reach you. Thomas Redhawk left a message. He needs you to come to town. Says it's urgent. Something about a gathering." Her stomach tightened. A gathering? Of what? Didn't say specifically. Just said to tell you that if you can travel safely, you should come to the tribal center tomorrow. Bring your documentation, whatever that means. She understood immediately. Other keepers. Other people who tended other boundaries. The network Thomas had mentioned. Whatever was happening was bigger than just her threshold, and it required coordination. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. Morning, probably around 10. She spent the evening preparing. She packed her journals, both the scientific observations and her personal keeper's record. She included Gerald's journal and the letters from Morning Crow, thinking they might be relevant, might help others understand the complications of interrupted knowledge transfer. She made sure Boone had enough food and water to last the day, though she hoped to return by nightfall. Sleep came poorly again that night. She kept thinking about what a gathering might mean, what she might learn, what responsibilities might be placed on her. She was the newest keeper, the one with the least knowledge and experience. What could she possibly offer to people who'd been doing this work for years or even decades? But she also thought about Morning Crow's letters, about Gerald's late-blooming understanding, about the way knowledge could be lost and found and lost again. Maybe that was what she could offer, a recent example of the stakes, of what happened when the chain broke, of how difficult it was to rebuild what should never have been torn down in the first place. She rose before dawn, dressed in clean clothes, and made coffee that she drank while watching the forest wake. Boone seemed to understand she was leaving without him again, and he pressed close to her legs, seeking reassurance. "I'll be back tonight," she told him, scratching behind his ears. "Just a day trip. You guard the cabin, okay? You're the keeper's dog now. That's an important job." The drive down the mountain was slow and careful. The logging roads were still muddy from snowmelt, and her old truck didn't have the clearance or traction it used to. But she'd made this drive hundreds of times over the years, knew every washout and rough patch, knew where to take it slow and where she could push a little faster. The transition from forest to valley always struck her, the way the trees thinned out and gave way to open rangeland, the way the sky suddenly seemed larger, less contained. By the time she reached the paved highway, she felt like she'd traveled between worlds, which perhaps she had. Shalley was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noted immediately. She'd been coming here long enough to be familiar, if not quite local, and a few people waved as she drove through the main street toward the tribal center on the east side of town. The parking lot held more vehicles than she'd expected, trucks and SUVs from across the region, license plates from Idaho and Montana, and even one from Wyoming. Inside, she found perhaps 20 people gathered in the community room, ranging in age from a woman who looked barely 30 to a man who might have been 90. Thomas stood at the front, talking quietly with a small group, but he looked up as she entered and nodded acknowledgement. She found a seat near the back, suddenly self-conscious about her mud-spattered jeans and worn jacket among people who seemed more put together, more certain of their place. But then a woman about her age sat down beside her and smiled. "First gathering?" the woman asked. She had kind eyes and calloused hands, the look of someone who worked outdoors. "That obvious?" Marla said. "We all have that look the first time. I'm Faye. I keep the boundary up near Stanley, by the hot springs. Marla, the old Kinsey cabin, Sawtooth Range." Faye's eyes widened slightly. "The keeper's crossing threshold? That's a significant one. One of the old sites. How long have you been keeper there?" "About a month," Marla admitted. "My husband died 6 months ago. I didn't even know what a keeper was until recently. I'm still figuring it out." Faye's expression shifted to something like sympathy mixed with respect. "That's a hard way to come to it. Most of us were raised into it, taught from childhood. But sometimes the guardians choose keepers directly, and those bonds can be the strongest." "The guardian at Keeper's Crossing accepted you?" "It did. Though I think it was a close thing. The fact that you're here means it saw something worth keeping," Faye said. "Trust that." Thomas called the gathering to order, and the room quieted. He stood at the front with the easy authority of someone who'd led many such meetings, his voice carrying clearly despite his age. "Thank you all for coming, some of you from considerable distance. I know this is short notice, but the situation requires coordination. As most of you know, the earthquakes that began 3 months ago have continued and intensified. 7 significant tremors in the past week alone, all centered in the Sawtooth and White Cloud ranges. The guardians are waking across the territory, not just isolated ones, but multiple sites simultaneously." He paused, letting that sink in. This hasn't happened in living memory. My grandfather spoke of a similar waking in 1872, following the massive earthquake that year. Before that, the oral histories mention a great waking in the 1770s, the Four White Settlement. These are generational events, times when the earth shifts enough to disturb the deep places, when the guardians rise together rather than in isolation. A man near the front spoke up. "What triggers it? Just the earthquakes?" "The earthquakes are part of it," Thomas said. "But there's more. Human activity has intensified. More development, more roads, more disturbance of the old boundaries. The guardians are territorial. When too many boundaries are crossed, when too many thresholds are disturbed, they respond collectively. It's a defense mechanism, in a way. A reminder that they're here, that they were here first, that the land isn't just passive resource waiting to be exploited." Another woman raised her hand. "Are we seeing aggression? Attacks?" "Not attacks, but warnings," Thomas said. "Livestock dying of no clear cause. Wildlife fleeing areas they've inhabited for generations. Unusual phenomena, lights, sounds, sensations of being watched. And in some cases, direct confrontations with people who've crossed boundaries without respect. We've had 3 families abandon their properties in the past month. 1 logging operation shut down after equipment failures and what the workers called bad feelings that wouldn't go away." Marla thought of the Hendersons, of their hasty flight. She raised her hand, and Thomas nodded to her. "The Henderson place near my boundary, they left about 3 weeks ago. Found their cattle dead, something wrong but not natural. They didn't understand what they were seeing, so they just left everything and went to town." Thomas nodded. "That's typical. People who don't have the knowledge or the blood connection. They feel the guardian's presence as pure threat. They can't communicate, can't understand what's being asked of them, so they flee. Which is probably the safest choice for them, but it leaves the boundary unattended. That's why this gathering is necessary. We need to coordinate coverage, make sure every significant threshold has a keeper who understands what's happening. We need to perform the proper ceremonies at each site, reinforce the covenants, make sure the guardians know they're being respected." He looked around the room. "Some of you keep multiple sites. Some of you are getting older and need to start training the next generation. Some of you," his eyes found Marla, "are new to this work and need support and teaching. We're going to spend today sharing information, updating the maps, making sure everyone knows which boundaries are covered and which need attention. And we're going to make a plan for the next phase, because the earthquakes aren't stopping. If anything, they're building toward something larger." The room buzzed with conversation as people absorbed this. Marla felt simultaneously overwhelmed and strangely relieved. She wasn't alone in this. There was structure, knowledge, a community of people doing the same work she was learning to do. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Thomas began calling on individual keepers to report on their sites. Marla listened to stories that echoed her own guardian's waking. Unusual phenomena. The challenge of maintaining boundaries in a world that increasingly didn't believe such boundaries existed. She heard about successful rituals and failed ones, about families who'd kept the knowledge across generations, and people like her who'd stumbled into it by accident or necessity. When it came her turn, she stood and told her story concisely. The eggs. Boone's warning, the Hendersons' flight. Thomas's intervention, her discovery of Gerald's heritage, and the broken knowledge chain. She described the ritual, the Guardian's acceptance, the hatching of the eggs, just days ago. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then the old man she'd noticed earlier spoke, his voice surprisingly strong. Keeper's Crossing. That's one of the 7 primary sites. The old songs call it the Eastern Gateway. If that guardian has accepted a new keeper, especially one not raised to it, that's significant. It means something is shifting in the old patterns. Thomas nodded agreement, which is why Marla's presence here matters. The guardians don't accept people lightly, especially at the primary sites. The fact that the crossing guardian accepted her suggests she has a role to play in what's coming. Marla felt heat rise in her face. She didn't want significance or special roles. She just wanted to understand how to do the work properly, to honor what Gerald had died trying to understand, to protect the place she'd called home for 40 years. But Faye leaned over and whispered, "Don't fight it. The Guardians know what they're doing, even when we don't. Trust the process." The meeting continued through the afternoon. They shared practical knowledge, which plants to use in offerings, how to read guardian sign, ways to communicate respect across the boundary between human and ancient. They updated the master map Thomas kept, marking new disturbances and confirming which sites had active keepers. They discussed contingency plans for what to do if the earthquakes intensified, if guardians became more actively aggressive, if the situation escalated beyond their current capacity to manage. By the time Thomas called an end to the formal meeting, the sun was low. People lingered, talking in small groups, exchanging contact information, and promising to check in with each other. Marla found herself surrounded by people offering advice, sharing stories, welcoming her into a community she hadn't known existed. As the crowd thinned, Thomas approached her. "You did well today. I know this is a lot to take in." "It is," she admitted, "but it helps, knowing I'm not alone in it. Knowing there are others. We're stronger together," he said. "That's always been true. The work can be isolating. Most keepers spend their time alone at their thresholds. But we need each other for support, for knowledge sharing, for the times when the work gets hard and you need reminders of why it matters." He handed her a folder. "This is information compiled over years' protocols for different situations, reference materials, maps. Study it. Add to it as you learn. And stay in touch. If anything changes at your site, if the Guardian's behavior shifts, let me know immediately." She took the folder, feeling its weight. "Thomas, thank you. For teaching me. For not giving up when I didn't understand. For bringing me into this." He smiled. "You were always going to be brought into this. The Guardian made that choice when it accepted you. I just helped facilitate what was already happening. The rest is up to you." The drive back up the mountain was long and dark, her headlights cutting through forest that seemed deeper and more alive than it had. That morning, she thought about everything she'd learned, about the community she'd been welcomed into, about the work that lay ahead. When she finally reached the cabin, Boone greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, and she held him close, drawing comfort from his solid presence. She was tired-bone tired, but also energized in a way she hadn't felt in months. She had purpose. She had community. She had work that mattered. Tomorrow she would return to the boundary, would walk the threshold with new knowledge and renewed commitment. But tonight, she sat on the porch in the darkness, listening to the forest and the distant river, feeling connected to something ancient and ongoing and infinitely larger than herself. The Guardian was out there, watching, waiting. And she was here, keeper of the threshold, bridge between worlds, carrier of knowledge that had been lost and found again. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The earthquake hit on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the gathering in Chalet. Marla was at the river, checking the water levels and making note of some unusual algae growth when the ground began to move. Not the subtle tremor she'd felt before, but a genuine shaking that knocked her off balance and sent her scrambling away from the riverbank. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, long enough for her heart to hammer in her chest, long enough for trees to sway and stones to rattle down the slope behind her. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt unnatural, compressed. Even the river seemed quieter, as if the water itself was holding its breath. Boone, who'd been lying in a patch of sun 30 feet away, was on his feet and whining. Not his warning growl, but a sound of distress. He looked at her, then at the forest, then back at her again, communicating urgency in the only way he could. She felt it too. Something was wrong, not just the earthquake, but something deeper. The air had that heavy quality she'd learned to associate with the Guardian's presence, but amplified, as if multiple Guardians were moving simultaneously. The boundary was disturbed. The threshold was unstable. She gathered her materials quickly and headed back to the cabin at a faster pace than was probably safe on the uneven terrain. The 7 sacred stones she kept as reminders sat on the porch railing, and as she approached, she saw that they'd fallen, scattered by the earthquake's force. The pattern they'd landed in looked deliberate, not random distribution, but a configuration that tugged at her memory. She'd seen something similar in the materials Thomas had given her. A warning pattern, a sign of imminent danger. Inside, she tried the radio immediately. Static greeted her, then fragments of multiple voices talking over each other. The airwaves were chaos, people reporting damage, asking for help, trying to understand what was happening. She waited for a break in the transmission and keyed the mic. Shalley Ranger Station, this is Marla Kinsey at Keeper's Crossing. Do you copy? More static. Then, finally, a voice she recognized: Thomas, not the ranger. Marla, this is Thomas. I'm at the station coordinating. What's your status? Earthquake hit hard here. Ground is still settling. The boundary feels wrong, unstable. My stones fell in a warning pattern. Something's happening beyond just the tremor. Copy that. We're getting similar reports from all the primary sites. The Guardians are responding to the quake. They're rising simultaneously. You need to go to your threshold immediately and perform the stabilization ritual. Do you remember the words? She did. Thomas had taught her during a follow-up visit after the gathering, showing her how to calm an agitated boundary, how to communicate that the disturbance wasn't intentional disrespect, but natural forces beyond human control. She'd practiced them, but never had cause to use them. I remember, she said. What about the other sites? Every keeper is being deployed to their thresholds. This is the big one, Marla. The event we talked about. The Great Waking. The Guardians are coming up together, and if we don't stabilize the boundaries, if they perceive widespread threat, things could get very bad very quickly. Her hands tightened on the radio. How bad? A pause. Then, bad enough that people will die. The Guardians don't distinguish between intentional threats and accidental ones when they feel their territories are being invaded. If they come up fully aggressive, anyone in their range is at risk. We need to calm them, remind them of the covenants, show them that the keepers are present and maintaining respect. Can you do that? Yes, she said, though her voice shook slightly. I can do that. Good. One more thing, if it goes wrong. If the Guardian rejects the ritual or becomes aggressive, you need to leave immediately. Don't try to fight it. Don't try to reason with it beyond the ritual words. Just get out. Understand? Understood. May the old ways guide you. Check in when it's done. The radio went silent. Marla stood for a moment, centering herself, pushing down the fear that wanted to cloud her thinking. She'd been chosen for this. The Guardian had accepted her. She had to trust that acceptance. Trust the relationship she'd been building over these weeks. Trust that the covenant meant something. She gathered what she needed: the copper charm, though she was already wearing it. Fresh tobacco and cornmeal. Sage from her dwindling supply. A small knife for blood offering, because Thomas had warned her that the stabilization ritual required more than hair. Blood for blood, earth for earth. The guardian needed to know she was committed, that she was willing to give something that cost her. She spoke to Boone as she packed. "You stay here this time too. I know you hate it, but this is different than the first ritual. This is dangerous." The guardian is agitated, frightened maybe, responding to forces it can't control. "I need to approach carefully, and I need you to be safe. Please, boy, just this once more, trust me." Boone whined, but didn't follow when she stepped off the porch. She closed the door firmly, hearing his scratch at it, his bark of protest. It tore at her heart, but she kept walking. If something went wrong, if the guardian killed her, at least Boone would be alive. Someone from the gathering would come eventually, would find him, would take care of him. That thought was a cold comfort, but better than nothing. The walk to the river felt different than all her previous walks. The forest was too quiet, no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The trees themselves seemed to lean away from the path, as if creating space for something large to move through. The air remained heavy, and she could feel a vibration in the ground that hadn't stopped even though the initial earthquake had passed. Aftershocks, she thought, or perhaps the guardian moving beneath the earth, rising toward the surface. When she reached the river, she understood immediately how severe the situation was. The water had changed color darker, almost black, with an oily sheen she'd never seen before. The current was faster, more turbulent. And the nest site, where the eggs had been, was torn open, gravel scattered, as if something had erupted from beneath. The guardian stood in the shallows 20 feet upstream. But it wasn't the form she'd seen before. This was larger, more solid, more distinctly aggressive in its posture. The shifting quality was gone, now it was fixed, defined, unmistakably dangerous. Its eyes, when they found her, didn't hold the considering intelligence she'd seen during the acceptance ritual. They held fury. She stopped at the tree line, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was worse than Thomas had prepared her for. The guardian wasn't just agitated. It was enraged, viewing her presence as a threat rather than as the keeper she'd been accepted as. She had to do the ritual anyway. Had to try. Because if she fled, if she abandoned the threshold, the guardian would have no reason to remain contained to this site. It would range freely, and people would die. She arranged the 7 stones in their circle, her hands shaking but still functional. She placed the offerings in the center. Then she took the knife and cut her palm not deep, but enough to draw blood freely. She let it drip onto the cornmeal, mixing red with yellow, creating the mixture Thomas had described. Then she spoke the words, not in a steady voice, but cracking, afraid, human. But she spoke them fully, correctly, putting every ounce of intention she possessed into the sounds. Ancient One, keeper of this threshold, I stand before you as the covenant keeper. The earth moves, but not by my hand. The water changes, but not by my will. I offer blood and respect. I offer presence and witness. I ask that you recognize the bond between us, that you remember I am guardian of your territory, not intruder. That you, the guardian roared, actually roared, a sound that was part earthquake and part avalanche and part something that had no name in human experience. It moved toward her, not slowly now but with purpose, each step covering impossible distance. Marla held her ground, though everything in her screamed to run. She continued speaking, her voice rising to be heard over the guardian's roar, over the sound of water and wind and earth groaning. The words came faster now, tumbling out in desperate succession as the massive form approached. That you remember the covenant given by your territory to those who honor it. That you remember Gerald, who walked this boundary for 40 years. That you remember Morning Crow, who taught the old ways. That you remember. The guardian stopped. Not gradually, but instantly, as if her words had struck something essential. Its head tilted, that disturbingly human gesture she'd seen before. The fury in its eyes didn't dissipate, but something else joined it. Recognition. She pressed the advantage, changing tactics. Instead of the ritual words Thomas had taught her, she spoke from her heart, in plain English, trusting that intention mattered more than specific language. I know you're afraid. The earth is breaking beneath you. Your deep places are being disturbed. Everything you've slept through for generations is shifting, and you don't know if it's natural or if you're under attack. I understand that, but I'm not your enemy. I'm here because I was chosen to be here, because you accepted me, because this place matters to me as much as it matters to you. She held up her bleeding palm. This is my blood, my commitment. I can't stop earthquakes. I can't control the earth, but I can stand here and witness. I can maintain the respect. I can make sure humans don't add to the disturbance. That's what keepers do. That's what Gerald tried to do. That's what I'm doing now. The guardian moved closer, and she realized she was trembling. Her legs wanted to give out. Her breath came in short gasps. But she held her ground, held her bleeding hand extended, held the eye contact that felt like it was burning into her soul. It lowered its massive head toward her. This close, she could see details that shouldn't exist. The way its form seemed to be made of layered realities. The way it was simultaneously physical and something else. She could smell the deep earth, the mineral darkness, the age of it. Then it did something that stopped her breath entirely. It touched her bleeding palm with what might have been a nose or might have been something else entirely. The contact was gentle, deliberately, carefully gentle, and she felt a shock run through her arm and into her chest. Not pain, exactly, but connection. Understanding passing between species, between forms of consciousness so different they shouldn't be able to communicate at all. In that moment, she felt what the guardian felt. The terror of the earth breaking, the confusion of boundaries dissolving, the ancient imperative to protect territory, to defend what it had guarded for millennia. And beneath all that, the loneliness of being something singular and eternal, while everything around it changed and aged and died. Tears ran down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry the earth is breaking. I'm sorry you're scared. I'm sorry humans have made it worse with our roads and our buildings and our forgetting of the old ways. But I'm here, and I'll stay here, and I'll remember. I promise you that." The guardian pulled back slightly. The fury in its eyes had softened, replaced by something that might have been sorrow, or might have been acceptance, or might have been both. It made that sound again, not the roar, but the deeper resonance that she felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. And she understood it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The guardian was accepting her stabilization, acknowledging her right to be keeper, agreeing to remain contained to this threshold rather than ranging freely in fear and rage. But it was also warning her. The earthquakes would continue. The disturbances would grow worse before they grew better. This was only the beginning of the great waking, and she would need to be strong enough to weather what was coming. "I will be," she said. "Whatever comes, I'll be here. That's what keepers do." The guardian held her gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the water. As it moved, its form began to shift again, becoming less solid, more fluid. By the time it reached the deeper part of the river, it was more suggestion than substance. It slipped beneath the surface, and the water closed over it without a ripple. The pressure in the air released. The heaviness lifted. The river's color began to clear, returning toward its normal blue-gray. Marla stood in the circle of stones, her palms still bleeding, her legs shaking so badly she thought she might collapse. But she'd done it. The boundary was stabilized. The guardian had accepted the ritual and agreed to the covenant's continuation. Whatever came next, this threshold at least would hold. She wrapped her hand in a bandana from her pocket, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Then she gathered the stones again, replaced them in their proper configuration on her cabin's porch where they would serve as warning and reminder. She scattered the remaining offerings into the river, completing the ritual. The walk back to the cabin took twice as long as it should have. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her exhausted and shaky. But when she opened the door and Boone rushed out, nearly knocking her over in his relief, she managed to smile. They'd survived. The threshold was stable. The work could continue. She tried the radio again once she'd bandaged her hand properly and made herself drink water. Thomas answered on the first call. "Marla, report." "Threshold stabilized," she said. "It was bad. The Guardian came up aggressive. But the ritual worked. We have an understanding." She could hear the relief in his voice. "Good. That's good. We've had mixed results at other sites. 2 keepers had to evacuate. Their guardians wouldn't calm. But most of the primary sites are holding." "You did well. What happens now?" "Now, we wait. Monitor. The earthquakes will continue, but if the guardians are stabilized, they won't add to the danger. People can evacuate if they need to without fear of guardian interference. That's the best we can hope for in situations like this." After the call ended, she sat on the porch with Boone pressed against her side, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees. Her hand throbbed where she'd cut it. Her whole body ached with exhaustion. But she felt something else too, a deep satisfaction, a sense of having done what needed doing, of having fulfilled a purpose she'd been chosen for. The Guardian had accepted her again, this time under the worst possible circumstances. That acceptance meant something. It meant she truly was keeper of this threshold, not just by default or by marriage to Gerald's heritage, but by her own choices, her own commitment, her own willingness to stand in the space between human and ancient when everything was falling apart. She would heal. The boundary would settle. The earthquakes would eventually stop. And she would still be here, keeping watch, maintaining respect, holding the covenant that stretched back generations and would extend forward into futures she'd never see. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered. The earthquakes continued for another 3 weeks, then gradually diminished in frequency and intensity. The Guardians, having made their presence known and having received acknowledgement from their keepers, settled back into their deep places. The crisis passed, leaving behind changed landscapes and changed people. Marla spent those weeks in constant vigilance, walking the boundary daily, monitoring the Guardian's movements, performing smaller rituals of maintenance and respect. Her hand healed slowly, leaving a scar across her palm that she would carry the rest of her life. She didn't mind it. It was a reminder of the moment she'd truly become keeper, the moment she'd stood between human and ancient and chosen commitment over fear. Thomas visited once the danger had passed, bringing news from across the region. Most keepers had successfully stabilized their thresholds. 2 hadn't, and those sites now stood empty, the Guardians having driven everyone from their range. The boundaries would need new keepers eventually, but for now they remained wild territories, places where humans ventured at their own risk. "You saved lives," Thomas told her as they sat on her porch drinking coffee. "By stabilizing Keeper's Crossing, you prevented the Eastern Guardian from ranging freely. There are towns in its range, ranches, families. If it had gone on a rampage, hundreds could have died. Instead, they just experienced earthquakes. Frightening but survivable." She thought about the Henderson place, still empty, slowly being reclaimed by forest. Will people come back? Some will. Some won't. That's always the way after a great waking. The land remembers, and some people remember too, even if they don't have the words for what they're remembering. They'll feel that this place isn't quite safe, isn't quite right for human habitation. Others will ignore the feeling and come anyway. That's where keepers become most important, making sure those who stay learn to respect the boundaries. even if they never know why. Before he left, he gave her a new journal, a beautiful leather-bound book with blank pages. For the next phase of your work, you'll need to document everything now. What worked in the stabilization ritual? What you learned about your guardian's behavior under stress? How the boundary responds to different conditions. This knowledge matters, Marla. Future keepers will need it. She took the journal with reverence. I'll do my best. You already are, he said. The guardian chose well. After Thomas left, she began the work of truly settling into her role. Not just surviving as keeper, but thriving in it. She started the new journal with a complete account of the Great Waking, documenting everything from the first earthquake to the final stabilization. She included sketches. She was no artist, but she could manage basic drawings of the guardian's forms, of the boundary markers, of the plants that grew only in threshold spaces. She wrote letters to Jesse, trying to explain what had happened, what she'd become. The first few attempts went in the stove. They sounded too strange, too unbelievable. Finally, she settled on simple truth. I've found purpose here, honey. I know you wanted me to come to Boise, to leave this place behind. But I can't. I'm needed here in ways I didn't understand before. The land needs tending, and I'm the one chosen to do it. Maybe someday you'll visit, and I can show you what I mean. Until then, trust that I'm happy. Really happy, for the first time since your father died. She didn't know if Jesse would understand, but she hoped that someday, perhaps when Jessie was older and looking for her own sense of purpose, the letter would make sense. The seasons turned. Spring deepened into summer, and the meadow around the cabin exploded with wildflowers. Marla tended her garden, walked her boundaries, documented the guardian's patterns. She learned that it was most active at dawn and dusk, that it preferred the deeper pools in the river, that certain weather patterns brought it closer to the surface. She joined the Keeper Network more fully, attending quarterly gatherings, sharing knowledge, building relationships with people who understood the work in ways no one else could. Faye from the Stanley site became a particular friend. They'd radio each other weekly, sharing observations and occasional jokes, the kind of connection that formed between people doing difficult work in isolation. One morning in late June, she woke to find 7 stones arranged on her porch railing. Not the ones she'd placed there. These were different, smooth river stones that she'd never seen before. They were arranged in a pattern she recognized from Thomas's teachings, a blessing pattern, a sign of favor. The guardian had left her a gift, an acknowledgement, a statement that the relationship was solid, that she was truly accepted, not just as keeper, but as something more, as part of the territory itself, as much a feature of this landscape as the river or the trees or the stones. She sat on the porch steps, holding one of the stones, and cried, not from sadness, but from a joy so complete it overwhelmed her. She had found her place. After 62 years of life, after 40 years of marriage, after 6 months of grief so profound she thought it might kill her, she had finally found where she belonged, not despite Gerald's death, but in some way because of it. Because his dying had forced her to truly see this place, to understand its depths, to recognize the covenant that had been protecting her all along. He tried to tell her at the end, stay here, finish the work. And she'd thought he just meant maintaining the cabin, keeping the garden going, surviving her grief. But he meant this relationship with the ancient, this role as keeper, this work of standing between worlds and holding the space for respect and understanding. She spoke to him sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evening, watching the forest darken. She told him about her days, about what she was learning, about the guardian and the other keepers, and the way the work filled her in ways nothing else ever had. She didn't know if he could hear her. It didn't matter. The speaking itself was enough. Boone grew older, moving a little slower, his muzzle going gray. But he remained her constant companion, her early warning system, a reminder that love existed in simple, uncomplicated forms. She would need to think about what came after him eventually, but not yet. Not while he was still here, still faithful, still doing his job as keeper's dog. The journal filled with observations and drawings and reflections. When it was full, she started another. Thomas had been right. The documentation mattered. She was building a record that future keepers could use, knowledge that wouldn't be lost the way it had been lost before. On the anniversary of Gerald's death, she walked to the river and spoke to the guardian. Not a ritual exactly, but a conversation. She told it about Gerald, his curiosity, his kindness, the way he'd loved this place, even without fully understanding it. She thanked it for protecting them both during the years when they'd been ignorant of the covenant. She promised to continue the work for as long as she was able. The guardian rose from the deep pool where it often rested. But this time, it was in its gentlest form, less aggressive, more fluid, the version of itself that seemed almost peaceful. It listened as she spoke, its luminous eyes holding hers with that impossible intelligence. When she finished, it dipped its head, acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even something like affection, then slipped back beneath the water without a sound. She walked back to the cabin as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The forest was alive with evening sounds, birds settling, insects beginning their night songs, the rustle of animals emerging for their nocturnal routines. Everything in its place, everything following patterns older than human memory. And she was part of those patterns now, not separate from the wild, but woven into it, a keeper of boundaries, a bridge between worlds, a carrier of knowledge that would outlast her lifetime and touch futures she'd never see. She made dinner simple food, eaten slowly, tasted fully. She read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. She lay in the bed that had once felt too large and found it comfortable now, perfectly sized for who she'd become. Before sleep took her, she thought about grief and purpose, about loss and discovery, about the strange paths that lead us to where we're meant to be. Gerald's death had broken something in her, but in that breaking, space had opened for something new, not better than what had been lost, but valuable in its own right, different, necessary, true. She fell asleep with Boone's breathing steady beside the bed, with the forest voice coming through the open window, with the certainty that tomorrow she would wake and walk her boundaries and continue the work that mattered more than she'd ever imagined work could matter. The guardian was out there, sleeping in its deep place. The threshold held, the covenant continued. And she, Marla Kinsey, widow, keeper, bridge between human and ancient, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.